Welcome. Good to see you. Thanks for being here and taking the opportunity as we continue our study of the New Testament books. And we pick up the second part of Paul's letter to Timothy. Going into 2 Timothy this evening, we've already covered 1 Timothy. And when we go to 2 Timothy, we're going to not try to repeat a lot of what we already talked about in 1 Timothy, just so that you know, and that will continue to keep us moving ahead as we trek through the New Testament as we've been doing. This letter, the second letter that Paul writes to Timothy, we would call the most tender and most moving of Paul's letters. Reason being is because this was his last one. All right, this was the last letter that he wrote, and again known by the title as 2 Timothy. And by this time, Paul was an aged man. And when he was writing this epistle, he was writing from that cold and dark dungeon of a Roman prison. And he knew when he was writing this letter, and it was no surprise to him, he knew that he had but a short time left to live. And so this letter has also been kind of called his last will and testament. These are the last words that the Apostle Paul will write, basically his dying wish. And again, this is his letter that he writes to his friend and co-worker Timothy. So this letter has a different, again, flavor. Even though it's to the same recipient as 1 Timothy, this is Paul's last words, so to speak. All right? Now, you'll note that as we've been working through, remember, we've been working through the New Testament books in the order that we have them in our New Testament. We haven't covered Titus yet, right? Titus is when we get together again. But remember, the order in which those letters that Paul wrote, it was 1 Timothy, then Titus, then 2 Timothy. So Titus was written in between. All right, so I'm trying to keep it clear for you. Titus was written before 2 Timothy, but even though we're dealing with 2 Timothy tonight, that's why we're saying, okay, these are Paul's final words, all right? Assuming that we've already done Titus, but we'll pick that up when we get together next week. 4 chapters for 2 Timothy. He deals in the first chapter with the spirit of fear. Not that Paul is afraid of anything, but he's helping Timothy with his spirit of fear. This is where we find that famous passage where Paul says God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of love and power and sound mind. Remember that? This is the chapter where you will find it, and this is what Paul deals with in the first chapter. By the time we get to the second chapter, he's talking about faithfulness and the sample of faithfulness that Timothy would understand and know, and would be one that is encouraged to be faithful in the ministry. Signs of the future, chapter 3. This is where Paul talks again with Timothy about what the last days will be like, right? What the future will be like, what he can expect to see, what he can expect to happen, what the world is going to be like, and all the rest of those good things. So that by the time we get to chapter 4, this is Paul's speech of farewell. This is where he says basically goodbye to Timothy. We don't know whether or not Timothy and Paul ever saw each other again, because we have no documentation that would indicate any of those details. All we know is that this was Paul's final words to Timothy in writing. So you can kind of perhaps imagine in your own mind now, as Timothy receives this letter, and as he reads what Paul has for him, that Timothy's response to this letter is good. It's most likely quite emotional, all right? Most likely quite emotional, and this is one of those letters that can, if you are getting into the flavor and the tone and all the rest of it, can be quite an emotional letter in itself. But let's deal with some background again. We've already dealt with a lot of background of Paul's letters to Timothy when we talked about 1 Timothy. Let's talk about the 2 Timothy background in specifics. As far as date and place written, Paul wrote this letter from prison in Rome around AD 67, okay? And this would be 5 years after his first letter to Timothy. So there's been a 5-year gap there, and of course a lot has happened. To give us a little bit better of an idea of what's happened over this history, AD 58 to 62 was Paul's first imprisonment. This is where the prison epistles were written, not for Second Timothy, Titus, and Philemon, but those other prison epistles that he wrote. By the time we get to AD 62 to 66, Paul is released from his first imprisonment. He continues on with his travels. This is when he would write 1 Timothy. All right, the letter that he first wrote to Timothy during his time of release. It's during AD 67, while Paul is in prison again, where he writes this second letter to Timothy. That's the second letter that's been preserved for us. Again, this is the letter that we're dealing with this evening. Now, there was one event in Rome that happened during Paul's time of release that led indirectly to his second imprisonment. And if you know anything about Roman history, if you know anything about the history of the Roman Empire, you know that one of the things that happened was the burning of Rome. In fact, we know that it occurred on July 19th, AD 64. The anniversary of Rome burning is actually coming up. Right? Because we haven't got to July yet, but we're getting closer every day. And of course, with the burning of Rome, that's under Emperor Nero. Remember from your history classes in school? And even though he tried to say that it wasn't him, the evidence all points back to him. But because of this event in Rome, because of what Nero had done, what he did was he blamed the Christians and ordered them to be arrested and punished for doing such a heinous act like burning Rome down. Now, it wasn't the Christians, it wasn't the church, it was Nero that did this. But again, blame shifting, the whole matter of trying to deflect the blame from him and pinning it on somebody else. And the church and Christians were the convenient ones to pin it on. And so for the remainder of Nero's reign, Christianity was illegal. All right? Nero had brought out that edict that Christianity was an illegal religion, and so waves of anti-Christian persecution rolled across the lands of the empire, and the church found itself in a difficult pressure situation once again. So when Paul returned east in the spring of AD 66, his enemies had no problem arresting him and transporting him into the prison that he found himself in Rome, and that would be the last place he would find himself as he would be on this earth. And he left the prison in Rome in only one way, and that was after he died, or he was executed. So this is the event or the main event that's taken place that brings Paul into the place that he finds himself in prison. Paul wasn't directly involved with what happened, but because of everything that did happen under Nero, it was easy for Paul's enemies to catch up to him and arrest him. So, with regard to why Paul wrote this second letter, the immediate occasion was Paul's desire to see Timothy and Mark again. All right? Paul understands he's not getting out of prison at all. Now, this is it. This is all. He can't do anything more. He has all his legal options are gone, and so he wants to see Timothy and Mark once again. And he especially wants Timothy to bring Paul's cloak, books, and parchments, which the apostle had left back in Troas. And so that's another reason why he's writing this letter to Timothy, was so that Timothy could go get these things that belonged to Paul. Now, why was the cloak important? Well, the cloak was for the damp of the cell and the cold of the winter. Because it was wintertime by the time all this was taking place. And, of course, there was no such thing as central heating. In fact, if you were cold in prison, that was just too bad. They didn't bother supplying the prisoners with the things that we take for granted and believe we have a right to. So the cold and the darkness and the dampness of the cell, the cloak that Paul had left in Troas would be helpful. And then there's two kinds of writing that Paul refers to, the books and parchments. Paul again requests Timothy of those things. And the latter, the parchments, would be the Old Testament scriptures. Remember, by this time the New Testament hasn't been put together yet, all right? It's on its way, it's in progress, but the New Testament hasn't been put together. So the parchments that Paul is referring to here are the parchments or the copies that he has of the Old Testament scriptures. That's what he's asking for. So it's kind of the same thing as what Paul is asking Timothy to bring: his cloak, his books that he that he had. What those books were, we don't understand what they were, but they were books. And then the parchments would be the equivalent of saying, bring my Bible with you as well. Okay? And that's why the accent that we find in the scriptures themselves are in this letter to 2 Timothy when Paul writes to Timothy, especially the parchments. If there's a choice that has to be made, leave the other things behind and make sure that the parchments come. All right? So Paul's desire again to have the scriptures in hand and to be able to read them again were of prime importance. So that was the immediate reason for Paul's writing of this letter, the second letter to Timothy. The main purpose, though, in writing was to inspire and challenge Timothy to take up the torch of the gospel ministry, because Paul knew that he was leaving this earth, and now Timothy would have to realize this and know that he's the next one that's going to pick up the torch that Paul will pass on. So that's the occasion and the purpose behind Paul's writing of this letter, which then takes us to the tone of the letter. It's different again from the first letter. In fact, this what we call Paul's last inspired writing has been called an epistle of what we would call mingled gloom and glory. All right? Paul understands he's leaving this world, but at the same time is not depressed or sad or those things that we might expect, knowing that this is the last writing that we will have for Timothy. The prominent tone of the letter, even in references to trials that he's experiencing, is still triumph and glory and Paul's deep gratitude for what God has been doing in and through his life and what God will continue to do. He trusts in Timothy's life. So Paul was not despondent, and he does not despair, even though he recognizes again that this is his final letter. So that's the background to this 2 Timothy letter. Before we carry on, any comments or questions here?
Would there not have been some concern that they would have been arrested when they came?
Oh yes, oh yeah, there would be that concern, but they were willing to take that risk because of their allegiance not only to Christ, but also their allegiance to Paul as well. So there was a risk there, but they were continuing to be involved. Didn't stop them.
Makes you wonder how they got the parchments back after his death. Because they wouldn't have quickly photocopied them.
No. Yeah, what happened with those parchments, again, we don't know. But somehow, some way, right, they would be distributed again. Okay, and these would be copies. These would be copies of the Old Testament books that were copied and copied and copied again.
So who would have been taking care of Paul while he's in prison and bringing in the necessities of life?
Well, most likely Timothy and Mark were involved, okay? And anybody else in the churches that would come to Rome and take care of him. Yeah. The churches were involved in that whole process, and how they organized it and who they sent and all the rest of that, we don't know. We have snippets of people who were involved in visiting with Paul, not only Timothy and Mark, but Epaphroditus was another one. Silas would be somewhere in there as well. We don't know how they organized it, but that's how Paul received the care that he needed to receive. Anything else? All right. So some prominent subjects then with regard to this letter. First of all, chapter 1, Paul here deals with what we call foundations of Christian service. Remember what Paul is doing with this letter. He recognizes that his ministry is literally dying out, okay? And Timothy is going to be now taking on Paul's mantle, so to speak, right? And so this Christian service that Timothy is going to be involved in, Paul wants him to understand some of the dynamics of this, because remember, Paul's burden of his heart was to inspire and challenge his young successor Timothy to keep witnessing for Christ, because Paul recognizes he's not going to be there to encourage Timothy along for much longer, right? So he's going to help him. It's no easy task to tell Timothy that afflictions were part of the price to pay for being faithful in his calling to Christ. Paul experienced that all through his life. From the time that he came to receive Christ on the road to Damascus to this point when he's writing to Timothy, Paul understood what it meant and the cost that was involved in following through and being faithful to God's calling. And so this is what he's needing to tell Timothy. And we find that Timothy was already experiencing some of these deep trials, the shedding of tears in the labor that he was doing. Paul talks about that in his second letter, verse 4 in chapter 1. Well, actually, let's pick it up verse 3. I thank God, whom I serve with a pure conscience, as my forefathers did, as without ceasing I remember you in my prayers night and day, greatly desiring to see you, being mindful of your tears, that I may be filled with joy. Ministry is not always easy. Now, Paul experienced that firsthand. By the way, Timothy experienced that firsthand, and Paul understood that. And so in this first chapter, this is what Paul is doing. He's wanting to encourage Timothy about the responsibilities that come with serving Christ, the foundations that need to be there to be continuing to be faithful in serving Christ. In fact, as he talks to Timothy, what Paul knew was that the foundations of the gospel were impenetrable, right? That if Timothy would and continue on with his ministry, he could be reassured that with these foundations of the gospel, he's not going to falter in his ministry. He's going to continue to proceed forward. But the key is this. Go back to the foundations of the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's what keeps you going. That's what keeps you going when the pressure's on. That's what keeps you going when things aren't going the way in which you'd like them to go. That's what keeps you going when things are going in the complete opposite direction than what you want, right? Paul didn't want to be in prison, but he was. So how does he continue keeping faithful to Christ when he's dealing with the issues of life that he's dealing with? It's the foundations of the gospel. And so what Paul is simply telling Timothy, here's what I've learned. If I keep going back to the foundations of the gospel and the gospel message of Jesus Christ, that's what kept me going in my ministry. Timothy, that's what you're going to need to. You're going to need to come back to those foundations of the truth, the foundations of the gospel, and keep you faithful in doing Christ's service. Again, Paul's saying all of this from the context that he recognizes he's not going to be here much longer to tell Timothy this. Right? So it's almost as if this letter now for Timothy becomes those final marching orders, right? After I'm gone, Timothy, continue with what I've told you, right? And so, how long Timothy kept this letter, we don't know. We know that it was preserved because we have a copy of it in our own scriptures now. But this would have been a very important document for Timothy. When we get into chapter 2, this is where we get into what we call the chapter of metaphors. And you probably remember this. After reassuring Timothy about the foundations of Christian service, then what Paul does is he writes about the ministry itself, but he uses metaphors to try and help Timothy to get a clearer understanding of what all of this means. It's in this chapter that Paul uses a number of metaphors, such as the athlete or the farmer, okay, to describe what the Christian servant is and to challenge Timothy to be a good Christian servant. So he uses the metaphor of an athlete, right? An athlete is focused. An athlete, if they want to be successful, is focused on what is most important and doesn't get themselves involved in all of those other issues that will distract the athlete from being successful in the race. That's the metaphor that he uses. Or as he talks about the farmer, the metaphor and the factor that a farmer is working hard and sowing so that he can reap. But the fact of the matter is, as he sows, remember, he's sowing not just for everybody, he's also sowing for himself, right? Because the farmer's got to take back some of the crop for his own use, right? But the hard and diligent work of a farmer, right? The hard and diligent work of an athlete. These are the metaphors that Paul uses that help Timothy understand the aspects of being a Christian servant. In fact, he even writes from prison, and as he's seeing soldiers, right, as he's in prison, because the soldiers would be involved in the security protocol of what's happening in the prisons. It's no surprise then that one of the first metaphors that Paul uses with regard to Timothy is that of a soldier. Notice as we go to chapter 2 of 2 Timothy, notice what Paul writes. You, therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus, and the things that you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men, who will be able to teach others also. You, therefore, must endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. Right. Being a soldier is an easy life, right? Now, we're not talking about the soldiers that we commonly know in this day and age, but we're talking about the Roman soldier. Okay? That's the soldier that Paul is referring to. The Roman soldier who willingly now, because of his role as a soldier of the empire, willingly sacrifices all that he's known with regard to his life so that he gives total and complete allegiance to the emperor of the empire. In fact, at least once a year, the soldier will go back to the temple in Rome and reaffirm his allegiance to the emperor by giving a sacrifice on the altar in the temple. And we'll talk about his allegiance to the one and only emperor of the empire. Right? That means all of his family ties, all of his friends, all of the life that he knew before he was a Roman soldier has now all been put off to the side for his service for the emperor. And as he serves the emperor, it's not all a bed of roses either, right? There's sacrifice involved with that. Whatever the commanding officer says, that's what the soldier does. You don't question it, you just do it. You see the metaphor that Paul is using here, right? He says you need to endure hardship as a Roman soldier does. That's part of what it means to serve Christ as well. There's hardship. At times you're going to have to endure that. That's part of the territory of serving Christ. Unfortunately, what's happened for us in our, can I say it, our soft North American way of life, right? These metaphors, especially the soldier, are metaphors that we find very hard to swallow because we have so many options available to us. And when we want to talk about serving Christ, we often want to attach to that all of those other things that make life fun and enjoyable. But in actual fact, sometimes what it means to serve Christ is that because of your allegiance to God, right? Because of your allegiance to Christ, that may mean denying yourself of certain things of life that everybody else might take for granted. That's part of serving Christ. That's not necessarily palatable in our lifestyle in which we live. This is the message that Paul is communicating to Timothy. This is what serving Christ means, and he uses those metaphors to help him understand. So when we get into chapter 3, then Paul talks about the last days. The first 9 verses of chapter 3, along with verse 13 thrown in there as well. Paul was a realist. And so what he was informing Timothy of, especially in this letter, was about the difficult times, the times of stress that were going to yet come upon the world. Okay? Paul wasn't specifically talking about what the Apostle John talks about in Revelation. But what Paul was helping Timothy to understand was that, you know what? When it comes to ministry for Christ, and when it comes to the ministry of the church, things are going to get worse before they get better. He talks about it in verse 1 of chapter 3, notice. But know this, that in the last days, notice the phrase, right? In the last days, perilous times will come. And then he describes what that will look like. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. And notice what he says, and from such people, turn away. I think it wouldn't be a very difficult task, if we were to take the time to do it, to go through each one of these descriptors that Paul gives to Timothy about what the world and society and what the church is going to be involved in, right? The mess of the world in these last days. I don't think it would take us long to be able to go through each one of these descriptors in the list and describe a particular situation, even in our own culture today, that would reflect exactly what Paul warned Timothy about. Right? Paul was a realist, and what he does here is he forewarns Timothy that, again, this ministry for Christ, and using the metaphors to help him understand the dynamics and the difficulty that comes with serving Christ, like an athlete, like a farmer, like a soldier. Okay? That's why it's going to be necessary to take on these characteristics. Why? Because of the perilous times, these last days, that Timothy and the church will find themselves in. And that's why the apostle identifies these times, as he says in verse 1, as the last days, referring to that time and place when these things will be, these descriptors will be predominant in the culture in which the church involves itself. This is the type of culture in which the church is to minister. These are the type of people that we are to minister to. I think we'd rather have the list be describing something else much more easy, would we not? But this is the dynamic of the Church of Jesus Christ. This is what we have been called to, right? To minister in this type of condition. And we don't have to look far to see those conditions. So, very, very interesting. Now, in regard to that, as he talks about this is where we get into that classic passage, verses 16 and 17 of this same passage, in chapter 3, where then Paul talks about the God-inspired scriptures. This is the classic passage of the Bible on divine inspiration of the sacred writings, okay? The scriptures themselves. And again, remember, as Paul is referring to these sacred writings, he is referring to the Old Testament when he talks about this. He's referring to the Old Testament. He's not talking about the New Testament because, again, it hasn't been put together yet. But he's talking about the Old Testament. God-inspired scriptures. The phrase inspired by God that we see in verse 16, all scripture is given by inspiration of God. This is that beautiful Greek word, theopneustia, right? Which means literally God breathed. It's the only time you'll find this particular word in the New Testament. Okay? You won't find it any other place, but you find it here in this passage, referring to the scriptures themselves, meaning that the scriptures were indeed God breathed. Now, I could spend a whole lot of time on this and the dynamics of this. We haven't got time to do that, other than to say this. Here's where we recognize the authority of the scriptures for us as his people. Why? Because remember, they're God-breathed. God gives these words to us. They are not just simply the product of several authors over a span of about 1,500 years, but these are the very words that God has breathed out for the benefit of us, knowing them, learning from them, studying them, memorizing them, recognizing that indeed they are our authority. If we want to know how we ought to be, the scriptures help us understand how we ought to be. How do we know that? Because again, remember who gave us those words. God. Right? That's why we talk about the authority of what we would call the God-inspired scriptures. Paul's farewell, of course, that takes us into chapter 4. As we said, these are Paul's last recorded words. They're written in a tone of urgency, but along with that urgency, there's a voice of triumph. Paul shows his tender care for his spiritual son, Timothy. And this chapter is the climax not only of this epistle, but I would say also the climax of the entire recorded earthly life of the man from Tarsus. And of course, the man from Tarsus was Paul. Okay? So I would say that this chapter would be that which is the pinnacle of everything that Paul shares with us in his epistles, everything that's recorded for us in the scriptures that Paul wrote, this would be the pinnacle of all that he had to write. Questions, comments there as we talked about those prominent topics of this 4-chapter book. All right then, let's get to those so what questions or those so what points. Let's deal first with this. 2 Timothy teaches many practical truths, not just for Timothy, but especially for us. For example, Paul talks about rewards for Christians. I think sometimes we don't want to really talk about that because somehow we think that, being rewarded for following Christ, doesn't that bring about an ulterior motive? I'm not serving Christ because the fact that he loves me and he gave himself for me, but I'm serving Christ now for the sake of what I can get, right? But what's interesting here is that Paul is not even ashamed one bit to talk about how God rewards his people as they are faithful to him. What happens here is that Paul, as he teaches Timothy about the rewards of those who are faithful, gives us an idea as well as to what happens when we are faithful and the rewards that we can receive as well. In fact, we'll talk about one of them as we continue on. Paul talks to Timothy about the discipline in the Christian life and what's expected. Again, remember those metaphors in chapter 2, okay? Same principles for us, right? If you want to know what it is to live the Christian life and the disciplines that are involved with that, and this letter helps us with those things. And again, discipline is one of those words that we don't like to talk about, right? Because it demands accountability. Discipline demands accountability. And we're living in a day and age right now where accountability is a bad word, discipline is a bad word. Paul reminds us in this letter to Timothy that successful or victorious Christian living includes the aspect of discipline. And we need to figure that out and be applying that in our lives. Timothy, this letter helps us to understand, the things that we need to flee and the things that we need to follow, part of that discipline, okay? That's included in there. The ministry of the Word of God to us. Remember, this is God's inspired Word. Paul reminds Timothy of that. We are reminded of that practical truth as well. Again, our crown of righteousness, this is one of those rewards that Paul was talking about. That as we continue to live the disciplined Christian life, as we understand what to flee and what to follow, as we allow the ministry of the Word to continue in our lives, we then continue on and move forward to this experience of this crown of righteousness that is awaiting for followers of Christ who are faithful to Him. Those are some of those practical truths that this letter teaches us as Paul taught Timothy. Something else that we find here as well is that this letter gives a description of the world in the last days. We just saw that a couple minutes ago when we were reading through the first verses of chapter 3 of 2 Timothy. And I would dare say that as we were reading through that, you were in your mind, you're going, yeah, I see that. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. I see that. Oh, yeah. No, I can give you a real good example of this, right? What this letter does for us is help us to understand why we are dealing with what we're dealing with today. Okay? Why do we have to deal with the issues that we're dealing with? The complex, difficult issues that have no simple and easy answers. Why are we dealing with this? Because that's the characteristic of what the last days is all about. And you and I have the privilege, understand the word I used here, and it was intentional. You and I have the privilege of serving Christ in this day and age that we find ourselves in. I think sometimes for us as a church, we're spending too much time fretting over what the days are like, rather than saying, okay, how can I be involved and how can I serve? Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay? We're more worried about what those days are like and what we can do to change them back to whatever we think would be better, okay? Rather than getting ourselves involved and like the athlete, like the farmer, like the soldier, roll up our sleeves and say, okay, These are the cards that we've been dealt. How do we minister effectively in this day and age that God has placed us? By the way, the reason why God has placed us in this day and age is because He believes and knows and understands that we're the ones that are best equipped with Him helping us to deal with those issues. It wasn't the fact that we got the short straw. It was the fact that God in His wisdom and His nature and His character said, these are the people I want to be ministering in this day and age in which we find ourselves. It wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. And you have, and I have, the privilege of being effective athletes, farmers, soldiers in this day and age in which we find ourselves. See how the letter helps us with that? Okay? And describing for us what these last days are like. This letter also helps us with the understanding, again, of what I would call, or what many call, the inerrancy of the original Scriptures. And what we mean by the inerrancy of the original Scriptures is this. Because they are God-breathed words, that means that all that is shared with us in the Scriptures, especially as God shared it originally, remember, this is a copy of the original words, right? This is a copy of the original words. But as God wrote, or as God had these writers write these original documents, they were without error in all of its content. Without error. Remember, God does not make mistakes. God in His nature and character cannot make mistakes. And so what He shares in His God-breathed word is that which is always faithful, always true, always strong. We can rely on it, we can stand on it. There is no doubt as to what God has said. What we struggle with is that when we recognize what God has said and how that's different from how we think, we struggle with, do I follow what God says or do I follow what I think? That's where the real struggle is, right? And this letter reminds us of that as well. The understanding of the power, the inerrancy of the original Scriptures as God gave them to us. As Paul reminded Timothy, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, it's profitable for reproof, it's profitable for correction, it's profitable for instruction in righteousness. Why? So that the man of God or the person of God may be complete, right? Complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work. Because in these last days in which we live, we need to have a base, or we need to have a standard from which we operate as we become effective ministers in these last days in which we find ourselves. How are we going to deal with these issues? We come back to the inspired word. This is where we find the answers. This is where we find the ways in which we can minister effectively to these issues that we deal with in today's world. If we don't have this, we have no basis in which to operate. That's why Paul reminds Timothy of that. That's why this letter is good in reminding us of that as well. Well, before I get preaching even further, I think what we need to do is we need to close it down for this portion. But when we get together next week, we'll continue into another letter of Paul's. That would be Titus, remembering that 2 Timothy was the last one in which he wrote. Valuable stuff here for us to continue to encourage us. Take care to read it this week. Only 4 chapters, so not a big book to get through. And enjoy it as you read it, and continue to thank God as you understand and know what it is that you read. Let's pray together. Father, again, thank you for your word and how it helps us in the things that we need to do. Father, it even helps us in what it is that you would call us to do in this day and age in which we live. Father, you haven't left us to our own devices. We have your word to help us. We thank you for it. Help us to spend the time to be found in it, knowing not only what it says, but how to apply it in our day-to-day lives in this time and day in which we live. Thank you, Father, that you have not left us to our own selves. You continue to walk in us. You continue to walk through us. You continue to minister to us as we live in these days. Give us courage. Give us faithfulness, we pray. In Christ's name.